More than 1 in 4 adults will deliberately sever all contact with a parent, but for one billionaire, that statistic became a 7-year nightmare. His daughter didn't just leave, she vanished, abandoning a life of unimaginable luxury. And when his global search finally tracked her to a gritty truck-stop diner, she looked him in the eye and uttered the 2 words he never expected to hear: "Go home." This is Robert Thorne, a real estate titan worth over $4 billion, and his daughter Sophia. To the outside world, it was a perfect life of private jets and penthouse views, but for Sophia, it was a gilded cage. Her disappearance wasn't an abduction, it was an escape. This is the true story of what happens when the heir to a fortune chooses a life of anonymous hardship over one of controlled luxury, and the single question that haunted her father for years: why? Robert Thorne didn't just build buildings, he built an empire designed to last 1,000 years, and he raised his only child, Sophia, to be its perfect heir. From the age of 5, her life was a meticulously scheduled blueprint: elite Swiss boarding schools, mandatory Mandarin tutors, and summers interning at the family office. Her friends were vetted. Her boyfriends were background checked. Every achievement was a press release. Every misstep was a crisis contained by a team of publicists. At 21, Sophia held a degree from Stanford and a seat on 3 corporate boards, living in a Manhattan penthouse with a 7-figure allowance. But the money, as it often does in these stories, came with invisible strings. A study from the University of Michigan found that in high-net-worth families, parental control through financial leverage is the single greatest predictor of adult-child estrangement. For Sophia, the breaking point wasn't a dramatic fight. It was a quiet Tuesday in October. Her father's chief of security delivered a 100-page dossier on a young man she'd met at a coffee shop, complete with his family's financial records and a risk assessment. That was the moment she realized she wasn't living a life. She was performing a role in her father's legacy, and the surveillance would never end. She began her escape not with a grand exit, but with a series of small, deliberate withdrawals. Over 6 months, she siphoned $40,000 in cash from her allowance, a trivial sum to her family, but a survival fund for a new life. She obtained a fake driver's license under the name Sarah Miller. She left her cell phone in a taxi near JFK Airport, knowing the GPS would send security teams on a wild goose chase to Terminal 4. Then, using cash, she boarded a Greyhound bus heading south. Her final text, sent from a burner phone before she smashed it in a truck stop bathroom, read, "I choose freedom over fortune, do not look for me." When Robert Thorne received that message, he didn't call the police. He called the former head of an Israeli intelligence unit, now running a private firm, and authorized a blank check budget. The search for Sophia Thorne became one of the most expensive private missing persons operations in history, spanning 4 countries and employing over 24 investigators. They tracked the bus route to Atlanta. They found the fake ID. And then, for 7 long years, every lead evaporated into static. The prevailing theory, whispered in family circles, was that she'd been a victim of foul play. But the private investigators held a different, more troubling suspicion. The lack of a body, the clean digital wipe, the cash withdrawals, it all pointed to a competent, voluntary disappearance. Robert refused to believe it. He built a foundation in her name, donated $30 million to missing persons charities, and told every magazine that his daughter was the victim of a sophisticated kidnapping ring. The truth, however, was far more painful to his worldview. Sophia was living less than 300 miles away. In a small Virginia town nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a waitress named Sarah worked the overnight shift at a 24-hour truck stop diner called the Crossroads. She rented a single room above a garage for $450 a month. Her worldly possessions fit into 2 suitcases. She had no bank account, no credit cards, and used a prepaid phone for emergencies. To her coworkers, she was just the quiet, reliable girl who always covered the holiday shifts. She was liked but unknown, which was exactly how she wanted it. This voluntary downward mobility is a documented phenomenon among some children of the elite. A Brookings Institution report calls them downwardly mobile elites, individuals who leverage their privileged education and social skills to navigate anonymity, choosing psychological autonomy over material inheritance. Sophia, now Sarah, found a grim peace in the exhausting rhythm of shift work. The constant fatigue was a price she willingly paid for the simple, profound ownership of her own choices. She decided when to sleep. She decided who to speak to. For the first time in her life, Her nervous system was not braced for an audit, a performance review, or a disappointed call from her father. But this hard-won peace was built on a foundation of constant, low-grade fear. She scanned every newsstand for her father's face. She flinched at the sound of helicopters. And she knew in her bones that the world of private investigators and facial recognition software was always circling, getting smarter every day. Her father's empire, meanwhile, was expanding. Robert Thorne acquired 3 major hotel chains and broke ground on the tallest residential tower on the West Coast. At every ribbon cutting, he'd pause and look into the crowd, a fleeting, heartbreaking hope in his eyes. He was a man who could move markets, but he couldn't find the one person who mattered. Until the day, a new piece of technology finally bridged the gap between his world and hers. A software update to a nationwide facial recognition system used by private security firms included enhanced algorithms for age progression. In the spring of her 7th year missing, a junior analyst at the investigation firm running Sophia's childhood photos against a database of driver's licenses and public camera feeds received a 92% match. The hit wasn't from a luxury hotel or an airport. It was from a Department of Motor Vehicles camera in rural Virginia, where a woman named Sarah Miller had renewed her license. The analyst zoomed in on the photo. The woman's hair was dyed dark brown, her posture was slumped with weariness, but the bone structure, the distance between the eyes, it was an undeniable match. The report landed on Robert Thorne's desk at 4 in the morning. He didn't call his security team. He didn't alert the local authorities. He ordered his pilot to ready the jet, and he drove to the airport himself. For 7 years, he had imagined this moment as a rescue. He would swoop in, save her from whatever hardship held her, and bring her back to the safety of her rightful life. He was about to learn that the most dangerous assumption a parent can make is that their child wants to be saved. The confrontation at the Crossroads Diner would not be a reunion. It would be a collision of 2 entirely different realities, and it would begin with a simple, devastating sentence from the daughter he thought he'd lost forever. The bell above the diner door didn't jingle. It was a harsh, metallic buzz that echoed off the linoleum. Robert Thorne stepped into the fluorescent glare of the Crossroads, his charcoal overcoat a stark anomaly against the faded vinyl booths and the smell of old grease. It was 3:17 in the morning. The only customers were 2 truckers at the counter, lost in their coffee, and there she was, his Sophia. Wiping down table 7 with a damp rag, her hair tucked under a faded red cap, a grease-stained apron tied over plain white tee. For 7 years he had imagined her trapped, scared, waiting for rescue. What he saw instead was a weary competence, a woman utterly in her element. His breath caught. He took a step forward, his hand reaching out across the chasm of Formica and years. Sophia, his voice cracked, her head snapped up. The shock in her eyes wasn't joy, it wasn't relief. It was the pure, animal panic of prey that has been finally run to ground. The rag dropped from her hand. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator case. Then louder, firmer, to him and to the entire room, "My name is Sarah, you need to leave." What happened next was not in any of Robert Thorne's scripts. There was no tearful embrace, no grateful collapse into his arms. There was only a standoff, measured in the pounding of his own heart. He pleaded. He promised to fix everything, to bring her home, to give her back her life. With each promise, she seemed to shrink further into herself, her arms folding tight across her chest, that defiant posture he now recognized from the security photo. "You don't get it," she said, her voice low and steady. "This is asterisk my life. You finding me doesn't change that, it just ruins it." One of the truckers, a large man with kind eyes, stood up. "Everything okay here, Sarah?" The use of her chosen name was a shield, and she grasped it. "This man is leaving," she said, not taking her eyes off her father. Robert, a titan who commanded boardrooms, found himself utterly disarmed. He left, retreating to the black luxury sedan idling outside. But he didn't drive away. He watched from the parking lot for 6 hours as the shift changed and she climbed into a dented Honda Civic. He had the car followed to a small, peeling house where she rented a single room. The investigator's report that landed in his email that afternoon was a concise, brutal biography of her new existence. Annual income, $28,000. Debt, none. Medical history, 1 emergency room visit for sprained wrist, paid in cash. Social connections, minimal. She was, by every metric of his world, profoundly poor, and yet the report noted she appeared to be in good health. She had no known addictions. Her co-workers described her as quiet but reliable. To Robert, it was a life of unimaginable hardship. To Sophia, it was a fortress she had built brick by brick. He tried a new strategy. Instead of a direct assault, he deployed what he knew best: capital. The next day, a suited representative from a property investment group approached her landlord and offered to buy the entire house for 3 times its market value, with the condition that all current tenants be vacated. Sophia received her 30-day eviction notice that evening. She didn't cry. She packed her 2 suitcases. But instead of reaching for a hidden phone to call home, she used the bulletin board at the diner to find a room share in the next town over. When a mysterious scholarship fund contacted the community college where she had secretly taken night classes in literature, offering to pay her full tuition and a living stipend with no strings attached, she dropped the classes. She recognized the architecture of his help. It was control dressed up as charity. A study published in the Journal of Family Psychology details this exact dynamic. In wealthy families, financial support is rarely neutral. It is a symbolic counter, creating obligation and eroding autonomy. Sophia had spent 7 years detoxing from that very currency. She was not about to relapse. Frustrated and terrified for her safety, Robert made his first catastrophic mistake. He sent a 2-person security team to her new address to, in his words, assess her living conditions and ensure her well-being. To Sophia, waking to find 2 unfamiliar men in dark jackets sitting in a car across the street, it was the ultimate violation. It confirmed every fear. Her father's world wasn't coming to save her. It was coming to swallow her whole again. She did the only thing she felt she could. She ran. Again. She quit her job without notice, withdrew the $1,100 she kept in a locked box, and boarded a bus headed west. This time, however, she wasn't a 22-year-old with a plan. She was a 29-year-old with trauma, and the chase was now active. Robert's network, alerted, snapped into overdrive. Her photo was circulated to regional private investigators. Her alias was flagged. The net, which had been wide and passive for years, was now tight and aggressive. She was tracked to a motel in Knoxville, Tennessee. This is where the story splits into 2 parallel nightmares. In Robert's nightmare, his daughter was unstable, vulnerable, and spiraling into danger. In Sophia's nightmare, she was a free person being hunted by the most powerful force she had ever known, her own family. The confrontation in Knoxville was brief and brutal. Robert, desperate, flew there himself and waited outside the motel office. When she emerged with her suitcase, he stepped out of the shadows. "Please," he said, all pride gone, "just talk to me, tell me what you want." What she wanted, she told him, was a legally binding document, a contract. In it, she would relinquish all claim to the Thorne family trust, every share, every future inheritance, in exchange for a single non-negotiable term, that he and any agent of his would cease all attempts to contact, locate, or observe her in perpetuity. She would disappear and he would let her. To Robert, it was like being asked to surgically remove his own heart. It wasn't about the money. It was about signing a paper that said, "I give up on my child." He refused. He countered with therapy, with a family mediator, with a penthouse in a city of her choosing. Each offer was a cage with a different name. She turned, got into a taxi, and vanished into the interstate system. This second disappearance was different. It was fueled by a new, chilling realization for Robert. She wasn't just running from him. She was running towards something he fundamentally didn't understand, a life she had built for herself, one she was willing to fight to the death to protect. The hunter was finally beginning to see that his prey was not prey at all. The psychological toll of this chase is documented in the literature on estrangement. For parents, especially fathers, the experience is often one of profound, disorienting grief mixed with a sense of unjust accusation. Robert Thorne was a problem solver. He fixed broken deals and broken companies. But how do you fix a relationship when the other person experiences your very existence as the problem? He began to secretly see a therapist who specialized in high-conflict family dynamics. For the first time, he heard words like enmeshment and coercive control. He was presented with research, like the Ohio State study, finding that over a quarter of fathers are estranged from an adult child, often due to unresolved conflicts around autonomy and respect. He started reading the emails and letters Sophia had sent in her late teens, the ones he dismissed as teenage drama. Plea for a gap year, the request to study art history instead of economics, the desperate note after he fired her first real boyfriend from a junior position at one of his firms. He had seen these as minor rebellions, correctable missteps. Now laid out in the therapist's office, they formed a clear pattern, a lifetime of her choices being invalidated and overridden. The billionaire was beginning to audit the emotional balance sheet of his parenting, and he was finding it deeply in the red. Meanwhile, Sophia's flight west had taken her to Arizona. Exhausted, low on funds, and feeling the walls closing in, she made a decision born of sheer desperation. She contacted a reporter, not from a tabloid, but from a reputable digital outlet known for long-form investigative journalism. She offered her story on one condition: it would be told from her perspective, using her evidence. She had kept records, photos of the security dossier on the coffee shop boy, audio recordings of conversations with her father's lawyers where her autonomy was discussed as a risk factor, the eviction notice from the bought-out landlord. She presented a case not of a poor little rich girl, but of a person exercising her legal and moral right to self-determination. When the reporter, intrigued, asked why now, her answer was simple: I need witnesses. If something happens to me, I need the world to know he was looking for me. She was no longer just hiding. She was building a public defense. The moment that article was drafted, the dynamic of the hunt changed forever. The private family tragedy was poised to become a public referendum on wealth, power, and the limits of parental control. And Robert Thorne, monitoring media keywords related to his family, caught the first digital tremor of the coming earthquake. The headline in the draft alert read, "The billionaire's daughter, heiress or hostage." His panic was instantaneous. A public scandal would terrify his board, spook his investors, and paint him as a villain. But more than that, it would force a final, irreversible judgment on his 7-year quest. He had one last, drastic card to play. He would go to Arizona himself, not with security, not with lawyers, but completely alone. He would find her, and he would say the one thing he had never, in her entire life, truly said. But he was already too late. The story had escaped its confines, and the consequences were now barreling down on both of them, faster than either could run. The article went live at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, and by 6:05, Robert Thorne's world was on fire. It wasn't a tabloid hit piece. It was a cold, meticulously reported 3,500-word feature, complete with scanned documents and audio clips. The headline was a question that answered itself: the billionaire's daughter, heiress or hostage? It detailed the dossier, the eviction, the security team in Knoxville. It quoted family estrangement experts who framed Sophia's flight not as rebellion, but as a severe trauma response to coercive control. The court of public opinion, fueled by social media, reached its verdict within the hour. Robert Thorne was no longer a grieving father, he was a controlling monster. His company's stock dipped 3% in pre-market trading. His board demanded an emergency call. And in a Phoenix coffee shop, Sophia, for the first time in 7 years, watched her story be told and finally believed. Robert's PR team swung into crisis mode, drafting statements about a loving father's concern for a daughter with mental health challenges. It was the worst possible move. Sophia's journalist, anticipating this, released a second wave of evidence: acceptance letters to graduate programs in social work that Robert had forbidden her from attending, emails she'd sent from boarding school pleading for permission to come home for Christmas, which were denied due to a necessary networking trip to Davos. The narrative solidified. This was not a rescue mission. It was the prolonged enforcement of a life sentence. The psychological concept of parental alienation was thrown around by his defenders, but experts in the article quickly dismantled it. Alienation requires one parent turning a child against the other. Here, Sophia stated, she was alienated from her own sense of self. The University of Michigan research on financial leverage in families was cited again, noting that the use of money to enforce compliance often leads to a catastrophic rupture when the child develops their own moral compass. Sophia's compass had pointed away from the empire, and she had followed it into the wilderness. Humiliated and cornered, Robert made his second catastrophic mistake. He instructed his legal team to file a motion in a New York court, citing extreme concern for his daughter's mental competency and requesting a temporary guardianship order that would allow him to secure her safety and well-being. It was the nuclear option, a direct legal assault on her autonomy. When the court filing was discovered by journalists, The backlash was immediate and devastating. Commentators drew parallels to abusive husbands using the legal system to punish fleeing wives. Memes of his face photoshopped onto jail bars went viral. More damningly, the filing triggered a response from an unexpected quarter, Sophia's community. Her former diner manager in Virginia gave an interview. "Sarah was the most capable, clear-headed person I knew," she said. "She balanced the books better than I did. If that's incompetent, sign me up." A trucker who frequented the crossroads posted a video online. "She was always reading these thick books about philosophy. She helped me fill out my tax forms one night. She doesn't need a guardian. She needs her dad to leave her the hell alone." The guardianship filing, however, had an unintended, profound effect on Sophia. The sheer legal aggression of it stripped away her last vestige of fear, replacing it with a cold, focused rage. She was done running. She contacted a non-profit legal aid organization specializing in adult rights and familial coercion. With their help, she prepared her own legal response, a petition for a restraining order against Robert Thorne and any agents acting on his behalf, citing a 7-year pattern of harassment and surveillance that now constituted a credible threat to her safety. The hearing was set in an Arizona county court. For the first time, father and daughter would face each other not across a diner counter, but in front of a judge. Robert, realizing the trap he'd sprung on himself, was desperate. The temporary guardianship was a long shot at best. The restraining order, if granted, would be a permanent, public mark on his record. He fired the aggressive lawyers. On the advice of his therapist, he did something he had never done. He listened. He hired a new lawyer, one known for mediation and family reconciliation. Her first instruction was simple: you need to understand what you're asking her to come back to, and you need to decide if you're willing to change that. This forced a brutal accounting. The therapist walked him through a psychological post-mortem of Sophia's childhood, the constant performance, the isolation from peers, the message, repeated in 1,000 ways: your worth is your utility to the dynasty. Robert had believed he was building her a fortress against the world. He now saw he had built her prison, with himself as the warden. The therapist shared data from a longitudinal study on parental estrangement. The number one predictor of potential reconciliation wasn't the child's willingness to forgive, but the parent's demonstrable capacity to change their behavior and respect new non-negotiable boundaries. It was about accountability, not negotiation. The night before the court hearing, Robert sat in a Phoenix hotel room, staring at a photo of Sophia at age 10, holding a trophy he'd forced her to compete for. He didn't see a champion. He saw a tired little girl. The empire he'd built felt like a hollow mountain, and the cost of its construction was sitting in a legal brief across town, asking a judge to make him a legal stranger. The courtroom was a bland, fluorescent-lit space, a universe away from the wood-paneled boardrooms he knew. Sophia arrived alone, dressed in simple jeans and a sweater. She did not look at him. When the judge called her case, her lawyer presented the evidence of the pursuit, the investigator reports, the bought house, the Knoxville incident. It was a clinical recitation of a 7-year hunt. Robert's new lawyer then stood. She did not argue against the facts. Instead, she stated that Mr. Thorne was withdrawing his petition for guardianship entirely. Furthermore, he wished to address the court. The judge, skeptical, allowed it. Robert stood. He looked old. The commanding presence was gone. He spoke not to the judge, but to the back of his daughter's head. "I withdraw everything," he said, his voice rough. "I came here to force you to see me as your father, but I never acted like one. I acted like an owner. I am sorry." He then turned to the judge. "I do not oppose her petition. She has the right to live in peace." The courtroom was silent. Sophia did not turn around. The judge, after a moment, granted a 1-year restraining order. It was a legal victory for Sophia, but it felt like a funeral. As the gavel fell, Robert understood the true price. He had not lost his daughter today. He had lost her years ago. Today, the law had simply made it official. But the story was not over. The public narrative, now a raging beast, had its own momentum. News crews descended on Phoenix. Sophia, protected by the restraining order, gave no interviews, but her silence was a vacuum filled by speculation, think pieces, and a growing cultural debate about wealth, parenting, and the right to self-determination. A famous podcast dedicated an entire series to dissecting the case, frame by frame. It was during this frenzied post-trial analysis that a former employee of Thorne Global came forward with a new piece of information that would detonate the remaining foundations of Robert's story. This employee had worked in the security department during the first year of Sophia's disappearance, and she claimed that Robert Thorne had been presented with credible evidence early on that his daughter was alive, well, and living under an assumed name, and he had suppressed it. Because a missing heiress was a tragedy that garnered sympathy, a daughter who had willingly rejected him was an humiliation his ego could not bear. This changed everything. The hunt was no longer a father's desperate quest. It was, allegedly, a 7-year cover-up to protect a billionaire's image. The scandal was no longer about family drama. It was about a potential conspiracy to manipulate public perception and waste investigative resources. The district attorney's office in New York, sensing the shifting winds, quietly opened an inquiry into possible obstruction. Robert Thorne was no longer just a failed father. He was a man with a target on his back, and the walls of his carefully constructed world were not just cracking, they were beginning to fall. The former security employee's allegation was a lit match dropped into a gas-filled room. A memo, dated just 8 months after Sophia's disappearance, was leaked to the press. It contained a field report from a private investigator stating a 95% confidence that subject Sophia Thorne was living voluntarily under an alias in Portland, Oregon, working at a bookstore. The recommended action in the memo was immediate discreet contact. The handwritten note in the margin, in Robert Thorne's own script, read, "Disregard, continue search for foul play." This was the proof. For 7 years, he hadn't been searching for a missing person. He had been funding a theatrical production where he was the tragic hero, and his daughter's autonomy was an inconvenient plot point he simply edited out. The New York District Attorney's inquiry into obstruction quickly became a formal investigation. The charge wasn't just about wasting resources, it was about the deliberate manipulation of a narrative to evade a truth he found personally unbearable. Robert resigned as CEO of Thorne Global to focus on his family and legal matters. The stock, which had stabilized, took another hit. The board accepted his resignation in a terse, 3-sentence press release. The empire was still standing, but the emperor had been stripped bare. In the face of potential criminal charges, Robert's legal strategy underwent a final, radical shift. Upon the advice of his new lawyer, he instructed his team to fully cooperate with the investigation. He waived confidentiality on all internal communications related to the search. He admitted, through his attorney, that he had seen the early report and chosen to ignore it because he could not accept that his daughter would choose to leave. It was a stunning admission of fault, a tactical surrender that sought to exchange legal mercy for total transparency. The legal analysts were split. Some saw it as a shrewd move to avoid jail time by showing contrition. Others saw it as the first genuine act of a man who had run out of other options. The DA's office, presented with this flood of cooperation and no clear evidence of a crime beyond a heartbroken man's denial, eventually declined to press charges. The statement read, "While the decisions made were profoundly misguided, they do not meet the threshold for criminal obstruction." Robert avoided prison, but the court of public opinion delivered its own life sentence. He became a permanent cautionary tale, a synonym for parental control gone malignant. And what of Sophia, the woman at the center of the hurricane? The restraining order granted her a priceless commodity, peace. The reporters, finding no crack in her silence, eventually moved on. Using a small stipend from the legal aid nonprofit that had helped her, she enrolled in a state university under her legal alias, Sarah Miller, to study social work. She chose a path dedicated not to building empires, but to rebuilding people. It was the ultimate rejection of her father's world, and the ultimate validation of her own. She found a small apartment with roommates her own age, genuine friends who knew nothing of her past. For the first time, her relationships were not transactional or monitored. They were chosen. Research on adult estrangement shows that this creation of a chosen family is a critical component of healing and building a stable new identity. Sophia, now Sarah, was finally building a life not in reaction to her father, but in alignment with herself. She waited tables at a quiet cafe to pay her tuition, a job she could walk to. The simplicity was no longer a desperate hiding place, it was a foundation. She was no longer running, she was growing. 18 months after the courtroom hearing, a package arrived at Robert Thorne's New York penthouse. There was no return address, Inside was a copy of a college textbook, Introduction to Social Work and Human Services. A post-it note was stuck to the cover. It read, page 234. His hands trembled as he opened the book. The page was part of a chapter on trauma-informed care. In the margin, in handwriting he hadn't seen in nearly a decade, was a single inked sentence. The first duty of any system is to do no harm. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a message in a bottle, a single data point sent from her shore to his. It said, I am here, I am learning, and I am defining the harm you did in my own terms. He broke down and wept. He framed the post-it note and placed it on his desk, next to that photo of the 10-year-old with the trophy. The two artifacts now spoke to each other, the before and the impossible, fragile after. The final, surprising twist in this story is not a reunion. It is a quiet, parallel evolution. 2 years after the textbook arrived, Robert Thorne quietly dissolved the Find Sophia task force and reallocated its massive annual budget. He didn't give the money to a missing persons charity. Instead, he created a new grant foundation with a specific mandate to fund legal aid, housing, and educational programs for adults seeking to leave controlling family situations and establish independent lives. The foundation's charter contained a unique clause: all grant recipients would be decided by an anonymous, independent board. The founder would have zero input. He was, in the most profound way he knew how, funding the very mechanism that had helped his daughter escape him. He was using his fortune not to find her, but to support the principle she had fought for. He told a confidant, I spent millions trying to bury the truth. The least I can do is spend millions helping others live it. It was an act of penance that finally aligned his money with a moral purpose, rather than his own need for control. Sophia graduated with honors. She never reached out again, but through the opaque network of the foundation she would never know he created, her father's wealth, once a tool of confinement, began to quietly underwrite the freedoms of strangers. It paid for security deposits for people fleeing abusive homes. It covered therapy for those recovering from familial coercion. In a cosmic irony, the Thorne fortune was now facilitating the very journeys of autonomy it had once sought to crush. Robert, for his part, lives a much quieter life. He sits on a few philanthropic boards, but the relentless drive for expansion is gone. The therapist he still sees weekly says he is a man learning the difference between legacy and footprint. A legacy is what you build for others to admire. A footprint is the indelible mark you leave, for good or ill, on the people you were supposed to love. He is learning to live with the shape of his own footprint. The story of Robert and Sophia Thorne is not a fairy tale. There is no tearful reunion at a diner counter, no magical reconciliation. It is a modern parable about the limits of power and the unbreakable will of the human spirit to define itself. It confirms the hard sociology. Estrangement is often less about a single dramatic event and more about the slow, soul-crushing accumulation of controlled choices. It shows that redemption for the powerful does not come from being welcomed back, but from the painful, permanent act of stepping aside. Sophia chose the grit of a truck stop floor over the guild of a penthouse because the grit was real. It was hers, and in that choice, she found a strength no fortune could ever buy. Their story ends not with a closed loop, but with two parallel lines, forever altered by their collision, moving forward separately under the same sky. One line dedicated to atonement, the other to a hard-won, ordinary, and beautiful freedom. The story of the billionaire and the waitress leaves us with a haunting question. What is the true cost of a love that demands ownership? Robert Thorne learned, in the most brutal way possible, that the deepest bonds are not forged in gold or enforced by security teams. They are nurtured in the quiet, fertile soil of respect and the terrifying, necessary act of letting go. His daughter did not need a richer life. She needed her own life. And in choosing the gritty authenticity of a self-made existence over a gilded inheritance, she taught a lesson that reverberates far beyond their family. Autonomy is not a luxury. It is a fundamental human need. We are living through a profound generational shift. The old scripts of filial duty and unconditional family allegiance are being rewritten. As the research shows, more than 1 in 4 adults will now choose estrangement over enduring what they perceive as toxic control. This isn't a rejection of family. For many, it is the desperate, last-ditch affirmation of self. The rise of this phenomenon challenges our deepest assumptions about loyalty, sacrifice, and what we owe each other. Sophia's story is an extreme version of a very common ache, the desire to be seen not for your utility in someone else's story, but for your own inherent worth. So what remains when the chase is over and the public noise fades? For Robert, a silence filled with the echoes of his mistakes and a penance played out in anonymous grants. For Sophia, a peaceful anonymity, the profound relief of being the author of her own days. Their parallel lines may never meet again. But in that separation lies the story's real, uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, love means accepting that the person you cherish may define happiness, safety, and success in terms you cannot understand, and may choose a path you would never have built for them. The ultimate act of care is not to bring them back to your fortress, but to honor the dignity of their own journey wherever it leads. If this story made you think about the lines between protection and possession, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. For more documentaries that explore the hidden layers of the human experience, subscribe and join us as we uncover the truths that define us. Thanks for watching.